I'm Carol Smetana, and I'm going to introduce you to the variety of information you can find in the pages of the Denní Hlasatel. The myriad of details that you can discover using some basic research techniques and perhaps a touch of serendipity. And don't worry, you don't need no check to use the archive and find information for your research. It's true that you're more likely to find information about a specific person who lived or died in the greater Chicago area. But Denní Hlasatel was not just a local paper. Although it was published in Chicago, it had agents and correspondents all over and a subscription-based match. This is a portrait of Annie Funda painted by her in-law Arthur Hewitt. I want you to remember Annie as we explore the pages of Denní Hlasatel. She was born in Bohemia in 1883 and immigrated to Minnesota by way of New York in 1912. In 1915, she married a man she'd known since childhood, a fellow immigrant named Frank Funda, who lived in Idaho. The couple farmed in southwestern Idaho for the next 50 years. Their son-in-law Art painted Annie reading the Hlasatel because it was a daily ritual for Annie and Frank. In 1965, Frank wrote a letter to the Denní Hlasatel. Quote, "We have been receiving the Hlasatel for over 50 years, so it is no wonder that we do not want to be without it, even if the subscription were to cost twice as much. So don't ignore this archive just because your family wasn't in Chicago. There are treasures for you too." What will you find in the pages of Denní Hlasatel? This is how the editorial office saw their mission in 1924. What are newspapers list? News about what's going on. They urged readers to send in news about deaths, serious injuries, natural disasters, train wrecks, criminal convictions, especially if our compatriots are involved. Also, they asked for community news, such as the construction of halls and Czech schools. You will find all of this and more in these pages. As Kevin said, the paper was a cultural institution, highlighting news of particular interest to the Bohemian American community. So when Nash died in Prague on September 2nd, 1894, the Denní Hlasatel fraternal societies holding national meetings in Chicago were given prominent coverage. On July 24th, 1916, the Denní Hlasatel commemorated the first anniversary of the Eastland disaster. When war broke out in Europe in July 1914, the Denní Hlasatel started publishing lists of wounded, sick, and dead soldiers in the Austrian army. They also published letters from Europe sent to family and friends in America. Sometimes you'll find them in a column called Echoes from the Old Homeland, letters relating to the war and received from friends and acquaintances in the United States. Occasionally, and I haven't been able to find a pattern to this or to very many of the columns in the paper, Denní Hlasatel published a column called Nehody, Accidents. All the accidents that are briefly recounted in this particular column from 1903 happened in Chicago, but not all of the victims were Bohemians. In this front page article, 3 compatriots injured by cars, the accidents were unrelated, but involved 2 Bohemians and a Slovak. Another column, published occasionally, was called From Bohemian Settlements in America. This one, from September 3rd, 1894, is almost 3 full columns. A few of the stories included Ed Krasa will be the first Bohemian student at the National Conservatory of Music in New York. The Pratt Public Library in Baltimore just received 300 Bohemian language books from Prague. Reverend Kozelka of Franklin, Wisconsin was injured when his buggy tipped over. And Mr. Peshek is running for property assessor in Hallettsville, Texas. There are columns for specific news from Chicago neighborhoods and for regional news from around the country. The kinds of news in the columns varied widely, and the columns themselves, their appearance varied widely. The Denní Hlasatel, of course, had classical ads of all types. Here's one: well-known midwife Marie Kralova announces her move from Blue Island Avenue to West 19th Street. Dr. Sokup urges Bohemian women to sign up for his midwife training class. In February 1926, companies advertised trips to the Sokol Slet to be held in Prague that summer. Bohemians responding to ads like this one from April 1914 founded the town of Louisiana near Alexandria in 1914. The ad announces the sale of 10,000 acres of land in a new Bohemian settlement. Quote, "Our land is so good, no swamps, no bogs, no rock or stone." For those of you who are familiar with term graves, this ad was placed in 1933 by Bohemian National Cemetery. It informs the esteemed Czechoslovak public that they're going to expropriate the individual term graves in blocks 1 and 3, and the esteemed public should go to the cemetery office to make arrangements for the reinterment of their loved ones who are now in those blocks. And of course, advertisers responded to the news. It hit Chicago in March 1920 and terrible damage to Czech California. It didn't take long for the Bohemian banks to push tornado insurance. On the same day Prohibition ended, the Joseph Trainer Company took out an ad proclaiming, "Trainer's wines and liqueurs are back again." Of course, you'll find campaign ads with familiar slogans: elect a man of the people and for the people, a capable and independent man of pure character. So lots of pages with lots of names. How do we find specific people and where? The Denní Hlasatel is best known among genealogists for its oznámení úmrtí, death notices. I call these death notices instead of obituaries because I think obituaries as being a longer form and having like a mini biography. A death notice individual is relatively easy to find if you have a good idea of the date of death. The death notices are pretty prominent and are usually grouped around page 3 in the paper. The Czech and Slovak Genealogy Society of Illinois compiled a comprehensive index of Denní Hlasatel obituaries that is available to their members on their website. It's by name and publication date of the obituary. But you don't need the most death notices were published a day or two after the person's death. So start by looking at the issue published the day after the person's death. A typical death notice will have basic information. Jane Ann Asborn's gives her name, the date of her death, her age at death, the funeral plans, and family members. The one for Annie Funda includes her maiden name and societies in which she belonged. And if we get lucky, we'll get one like Václav Hamer's that includes the name of the village where he was born. So hooray, you found your ancestor's death note. Don't stop there. Check for the subject in the úmrtí column, the deaths column. This column is usually on the first page, but there isn't a úmrtí column for every issue, and not every deceased is mentioned in the column. Most of the time, even if you do find your person in the úmrtí column, you'll find it simply repeats the information from the obituary or the death notice in prose form, but not always. Sometimes there's a additional detail or two in the úmrtí column. Anthony Mielek's entry gives a few details about his career as a druggist. Have you already gotten your Denní Hlasatel death announcement and the relevant úmrtí? Wait, don't stop. There might be more. Václav Kobzina's death notice takes up almost half a page. After I found it on page 3, I turned to the first page of the issue to look for an úmrtí column. He's not included in the column. No wonder. There is a full-length obituary for Václav right there on page 1. There was no úmrtí column on the day Julius Kins died, and on the day his death notice was published. I searched the rest of this issue by his surname. Kevin will show you how to do that. And I found him on the first page in one of those random columns. This one, News from Cicero. The article gives a detailed account, TMI really, of his suffering and death from intestinal ulcers, and it gives an exact date of his arrival in the United States. There are other items in this column as well. First aid demonstration at Sokolslavsky, William Makova injured by a car, work risk, an escapee from Elgin who got arrested at his home in Cicero. Finding these kinds of non-death mentions will be difficult without knowing a date, and it'll take some serendipity. George, the soldier killed in action in France on November 4th, 1918. His death was published half years later on April 1st, 1921, when his remains were repatriated after the war. I found it by finding his name in the Denní Hlasatel index, and even though the date was right, I went looking. There was nothing else in this on April 21st, 1921 about George, but because the community revered Bohemian American soldiers who fought in the Great War, I used his surname to search the next day's issue. I found an obituary for George in the From Cicero column. And in that same issue, I found another death notice that was not listed in the SAGC index. Why were there two death notices? Perhaps to make this correction. The first one, published April 1st, gave his death date as October 4th. The second one, published the next day, gave his death date as November 4th, 1918, which is the date on his grave marker. This obituary for Vincent Kins was published on February 23rd, 1926, the day after he died. Beneath his name, it says Vojen ze Světové války, soldier from the World War. I know that they sometimes print something called a Vzpomínka, and 1 year later, there were two remembrances for Vincent published on the anniversary of his death. The remembrance, Vzpomínka, from his family includes a photo that was not in the original obituary. On the first anniversary of the Eastland disaster, the Denní Hlasatel published 4 pages of remembrances, many of them with photos that had not been included with the death notices a year before. Josef Kosa died on January 5th, 1914. The death notice published on January 7th said he died after being injured January 3rd. He was not mentioned in the emergency deaths, but a search for his name in the same issue as his death notice turned up a mention on page 2 in a column called From the Courtrooms. This is another one of those irregular columns. Among the several reported items was that of a chauffeur whose initial charge of assault was changed to murder when the pedestrian he hit, Josef Kos, died from injuries. Since the Denní Hlasatel loved to publish stories about accidents, I started working backward from the January 7th issue to see if I could find additional details. In the January 6th paper, I found this long obituary with a photo and detailed account of the accident that killed him. This was printed the day before his obituary and was printed the day after he died. I continued searching earlier issues for an initial report of the accident. I found it on the front page of the January 4th issue in another column called From Our Pilsen, under the subheading Countryman Injured by Automobile. Don't stop with finding the obituary. Peter Pisha was buried at Chicago's Bohemian National Cemetery on February 25th, 1926, which means he probably died 2 or 3 days earlier. He wasn't listed in the SAGC index, so I started searching with the February 23rd issue, 2 days before his burial. And there on the front page was an almost I found the burial fact in the Bohemian Cemetery records. There on the front page was an almost 5,000 word obituary for Peter Pisha. In February 21st, from injuries that he'd sustained in an accident. Oh, I'm sorry, from a gas leak. He died 21st from a gas leak in his room in a boarding house. The article tells us that he emigrated with his parents when he was still an infant, gives us the names of his siblings and their occupations, tells us about his occupation and his 2 marriages. It's a treasure trove of leads for further research. Then I realized I'd only looked up PSA in the SAGC index, not the anglicized phonetic spelling PISA. Here's what I found. His death notice was published on February 24th, but it was the day after the obituary. No death notice? Even if there was a notice, a nominee or umerti for your person, the Denní Hlasatel still might have published something about the death. If you know the date of death, or even an approximate date of the death, search within several issues of the day of death. Search at least for 3 successive days, and maybe even search the actual day of death. Kevin will explain the technical aspects of searching in the online archives, but the framework is straightforward. Select the year, go to the month and select the date, open the issue. Search the PDF by the letters of the person's surname. Repeat the search on surrounding dates and follow any leads you might find. These are coroner's office news items. The June 4th article on the reports the date of the deaths of a 3-week-old boy from the Hayich family and an 8-month-old boy from the Kozla family. Neither has a death notice in the paper. The middle column reports 4 deaths. Pavel Straka, a recent immigrant, was killed by a train. 9-year-old Marie Pavnikova died from kidney disease. 31-year-old William McCarthy died from a work accident, and 6-year-old George Carson died from convulsions. None of them has a death notice or an obituary in the Denní Hlasatel. The article on the right reports an inquest into the death of Joseph Haina. There are no Denní Hlasatel death notices, or obituaries as you call them, for any of these people. If you have an article about your ancestor from an English language paper, check the Denní Hlasatel to see if they also reported the news. This article, Slain by Bandits, is about the death of my cousin Benjamin Makuta. It was on page 8 of the Chicago Tribune. There was no death notice in the Denní Hlasatel for Benjamin, but since he was murdered, I still looked for some mention of his death. I found this article published on the same day as the Tribs, but it was on the first page of the Denní Hlasatel, and it was an column long. Had the same photo, but more detail of his family, names including maiden name of his wife, names and ages of his 3 children, names of his parents, including his widowed mother's maiden name, and where she lived. Here's another front page article from 1934 about the death of a Slovak, Jerry Pilat. His death was thought to be a gang murder related to bootlegging. The article tells us Jerry was at Christine's restaurant eating chili con carne when he was shot. His last words were for his wife, "Tell Ellis I love her." There was no death notice or obituary in the Hlasatel for Jerry Pilat either, just this long article. According to vital records, Jan Pavlik died on October 22, 1914, when he was only 10 years old. What happened? I opened the October 23rd Denní Hlasatel, published the day after his death. I found this column-long article and photo. Jan was hit in a streetcar while he's on his way to meet his father Monday evening. The article said they had previously about the accident, so of course I went in search of that article too. The first report of the accident was from Czech, California, an irregular column that showed up on October 20th, 3 days earlier. There are no death notice for Jan Pavlik in the Denní Hlasatel. Enough about deaths for now. I haven't come across any birth notices yet, but there are some marriage notices. The ones I found so far fall into 2 main categories. Congratulatory ads like these are often grouped on the same page as the death note, but they usually stand out because of their more ornate borders. These ads give little more than the name of the married couple, the date of the wedding, the names of whoever placed the ad, usually relatives. They seem to have been published on the day the weddings took place. Occasionally, though, there were lists of marriages in the Denní Hlasatel. The one on the left, labeled simply marriages, lists only names and ages. The one in the middle, labeled Bohemian Marriages, lists couples married by Reverend Václav Vaniak, a Protestant minister in Chicago. It gives dates, names, and addresses of the groom and bride, and names of the witnesses. The one on the right, labeled Marriages Solemnized Before the Speaker of the Free Thought Community, also lists date of marriages, names and addresses of the groom and bride, and names of witnesses. I don't know how comprehensive these marriage notices are. The best way to find these is by searching by date for a particular name. In my browsing, I came across a front page article, 3,000 words, on the wedding anniversary of Antonin and Maria Rezek. It tells where they were born, when they immigrated, and describes their lives in the United States. Of course, some marriages ended up in divorce. They were reported in a column with the heading Broken Households. This article from February 1926 recounts divorces granted in 3 requests, with details about the reasons for the divorce and the settlement granted. Some weddings never took place. While searching for some samples of marriage lists for this presentation, I came upon this court column. Appreciate this language. On September 29th, the police arrested a Pole, Joseph Donaski, on a warrant sworn by a Czech girl, Marie Plachetkova. She charged him with paternity and embezzlement under false pretenses. She had been with the young man for 2 years, and like many others before her, she believed him. Now that the consequences of their intimate acquaintance were beginning to be visible, Joseph Donaski promised to settle everything by marriage if only he had decent clothes. The girl, thinking that her lover meant it, gave him $40 in cash so that he could buy the clothes and obtain a marriage license. Donaski did indeed buy the clothes and even obtained a marriage license, but with a Polish woman, Mary Smolinska, whom he had already married before Zdrubek. Plachetkova devastated by this infidelity, decided to prosecute him. She took out a warrant for his arrest before Justice of the Peace Sabbath, and Constable Peck arrested him yesterday after a 3-day search. Donaski was just preparing to leave Chicago with his bride, never to return. Since he could not post bail in the amount of $1,500, he was taken to the county jail. The hearing was set for October 3rd. Marie Plachetkova was my first cousin twice removed. I did not know about this jilted relationship that ended up in court on September 29, 1901. 2.5 months later, on December 15, 1901, Marie Plachetkova gave birth out of wedlock to a baby girl, Mulata. We had no idea who Mulata's father might be until now. Serendipity. These examples have been about people from the Chicago area. But what if your people didn't live in the Chicago area? Remember Annie and Frank Funda. After 50 years in Idaho, they moved to Oregon to be with family. Denní Hlasatel remained a vital part of their daily lives, keeping them in touch with their fellow immigrants. Over the years, Frank wrote several letters to the newspaper. In his letter published in 1965, he wrote, "I wish the entire editorial team all the best this year and many new subscribers, so that our Hlasatel can continue to entertain us for a long time and bring us news from our compatriots from all over America." There are articles, paragraphs, and tidbits about people from all over the country and indeed from the homelands. Unfortunately, except for references to deaths, these can be more difficult to find. If you know the death date, you can follow the same search path to see if there was mention of the death. Target the issues after the death, but you'll probably have to extend your search past just the first 2 or 3 days after death, perhaps as far out as a week or two. If you have no idea of the date of an event connected with your person, then you probably have to hope for serendipity. Carl Ripple died January 3rd, 1923 in Fayette County, Texas. I started looking in the January 10th paper a week after his death and used the search function in each issue. I found news of Carl's death in the January 12th issue, 9 days after his death. It was in a column, News from Texas. His death was the lead item and gave lots of relevant logical information. Joseph Chop's death by suicide on March 18, 1903 is recorded in Ohio Vital Records. 4 days later, on March 22nd, the Denní Hlasatel published the story about his suicide in a column called From Bohemian American Settlements. This column was published occasionally and gave seemingly random, unrelated information about Czechs from around the country. The story of Joseph Chop's death in Cleveland, Ohio, was not the lead item in the column. The lead item reported that the small Czech school in La Crosse, Wisconsin, was greatly distressed. Anna, the only daughter of the widow Mrs. Teresa Frischova, ran away to Milwaukee with her boyfriend Rubik to get married. The check of the records reveals that they did indeed get married on March 3rd, the day after this was published. One sample column, published August 20th, 1901, mentioned 12.5 names of compatriots, almost a dozen places ranging from New York across the Midwest to Nebraska and south to Texas. Included were items about in Cedar Rapids, Karl Petrovitsky is suing his brother-in-law Joseph Pospisil, claiming Joseph deprived him of the love of his good-loving wife for 8 years. A 58-year-old cigar maker in New York City, Chihak, hanged himself, leaving behind his wife and 6 children. A storm in Breslau, Texas, destroyed the house, farm equipment, and cotton crop of Mr. Svetlik, who also sustained injuries. Finally, in Cleveland, Ohio, a doctor was called to the home of Joseph Katala because the entire family was sick. Joseph, his wife, and their 6 children were all taken to the hospital where 8-year-old son František died on August 24th from trichinosis. This article ends, "As a warning, we state the cause of the disease. Mrs. Kotalova bought pork from the butcher on Sunday, July 20th, which contained trichinella, which she could not have known about. She baked the meat for lunch, but did not cook it properly, so the trichinella were not killed and got into the stomach with the meat, and from there spread throughout the body. Our cooks should pay special attention to making sure that pork is well cooked, whether it is boiled or steamed. This is the most reliable protection." Note that the dates of the events in this column range from August 13th to August 24th. The column itself was published on August 29th. Only the 2 deaths would be relatively easy to search for. It would take some serendipity to find any of these other mentions. But my favorite part of the Denní Hlasatel are the letters, like the ones Frank Funda wrote. Windows into the lives of their readers, their families, and their communities, and a communication lifeline. There's no index for these letters, so it will take some serendipity to find a letter that is written by your ancestor, or mentions your ancestor, or even describes life in the small town where they live. But it can happen. These two columns, from Friendly Letters and About Women for Women, generally appeared on Sundays. They included letters from both men and women and covered a wide variety of subjects, describing where they live, travel logs of trip they take, descriptions of Bohemian settlements, weather, crops, harvests, employment opportunities, local events, cooking and household tips, etc. Almost anything you can imagine. You can search these by surname and city, but only one issue at a time. From Friendly Letters, written mostly by men, they often wrote about their crops, farming, weather, the employment situation, their travels, and encouraging Bohemian other readers to join new settlements. This full-page spread of letters from February 22nd, 1903 offers a wide variety of commentary. Carl Vesely from Los Angeles extols the beauty of Southern California. John Kell from Florida, Minnesota, includes a special note to Václav Čečka. They need a butcher in Danube, Minnesota. F.F. Nadvorník from Dickinson, North Dakota, describes in great detail his ocean journey to America. And Josefina Mrazova from Reading, Pennsylvania, the only female in the group, laments the many Czechs in the area where she lives and the dances that are organized by the Slovaks and the Poles. This column started out as a column of news specifically about women for women, but then gave way mostly to letters written by women, who occasionally included photos. On January 25th, 1914, the Denní Hlasatel published a letter from Maria Gabrielova of Racine Lake, Wisconsin. It featured this wonderful photo of her husband, son-in-law, and his brother after a successful hunting trip. Among the letters on this page of Men for Women is one from Antonia Polakova, who lived in Chicago but was writing from Tillman, Florida, where she was visiting her son and his family. She notes in closing that she had to return home after several weeks because I still have interests in the North. However, I can already say with certainty that I have experienced my last winter in the North and future winters will be in Florida. When my affairs in the North are settled, I will move there for good. In another letter, Rujna Ivan from Canada requests that they publish news from Canada instead of Mexico because there are many subscribers in Canada. And then she offers advice on how a baby should be fed if the mother has no breast milk. I'm fascinated by the photos. I started reading this particular letter and quickly realized her story sounded familiar. The letter was written by the Moravian immigrant mother of a close friend of mine here in northern New Mexico, for whom I had done genealogy research a decade ago. Teresia Matskova begins her letter, "I want to show off my picture to the readers of Hlasatel and that I have already experienced a lot in America in just 10 years of living here." She goes on to describe the family moves from Texas to Oklahoma to Colorado and back to Texas. This immigrant family subscribed to Denní Hlasatel, even though they lived in Texas, and Teresia wrote a letter and sent a photo, and I happened upon it. My friend had no idea that her mother had written this letter, and she was still thrilled to see this photo for the first time. In another letter to the Denní Hlasatel, Funda wrote about Annie. She drops everything and starts reading the Denní Hlasatel. She often ends up taking away my lunch because it is burned. She calls it well done. Browsing the pages of Denní Hlasatel is a step into another world, a time long past. The issues are not always easy to search. It will take time and different approaches. But I hope this glimpse of what you might find convinces you that it's well worth your effort. At the least, you will get a sense of what life was like for the immigrants and their families, how they learned their culture here, but kept connected with the culture of their homeland. And with some perseverance, you might find news about someone in your family tree. And there's always serendipity. Thank you.